The cold hit her hands like knives. Margaret stumbled through the blinding snow, her vision whiting out as the blizzard screamed around her. She'd been foolish to try reaching the north pasture alone, foolish to think she could repair that fence before the storm hit. But Jackson Reeves had cut her wire again, and her cattle were wandering. She couldn't afford to lose even one head. The snow had come faster than anyone predicted, and now she was lost somewhere between her ranch house and oblivion. Her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves 10 minutes ago. Now her hands felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and useless. She couldn't feel her face anymore either. The wind cut through her cloak like it wasn't there at all, and each breath burned her lungs with ice. She tried to call for help, but the wind tore the words away unheard. Then she saw him, a dark shape moving through the white, solid and real when everything else was chaos. Nathan Cordell, the widowed sheriff of Stone Valley, on his gray gelding, searching. For her, she realized with a jolt. He'd come looking for her. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, something she'd been trying to ignore for months now. He swung down from his horse before it even stopped moving, his tall frame cutting through the storm like he was immune to the cold. His thick, dark auburn hair was covered in snow, his steel blue eyes locked on her face with an intensity that made her forget, just for a moment, how frozen she was. He wore a heavy wool coat and leather gloves, and even through the snow she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the strength in the way he moved. "Margaret," he said, and his deep voice somehow cut through the wind. Not Mrs. Coleman, not ma'am, just her name in a way that made her stomach flutter. He reached her in 3 long strides, and his hands gripped her shoulders, steadying her when she swayed. "Your hands. Show me your hands." She tried to lift them, but they wouldn't cooperate. He peeled off her gloves with gentle efficiency, and she heard him curse under his breath when he saw her fingers, white and waxy. Frostbite. Bad. He looked up at her face, and something fierce flashed in those blue eyes. "This is going to seem improper," he said roughly, already shrugging out of his coat, "but I don't give a damn about proper right now." Before she could process what he meant, his hands went to his shirt, and he ripped it open. Buttons scattered into the snow. The sight of him, his broad chest bare and powerfully muscled, stopped her breath more effectively than the cold ever could. She'd been a married woman, had seen her late husband undressed. But Nathan Cordell shirtless in a blizzard was something else entirely. Something that made heat flood through her frozen body in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. His skin was tan, despite the winter, marked with old scars she wanted to ask about. And she could see the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the flex of muscle as he moved. He took her frozen hands in his and pressed them flat against his chest, against all that warm bare skin, and held them there with his own larger hands covering hers. The heat of him was shocking, painful, perfect. She gasped, and her eyes flew to his face. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something raw and hungry that made her pulse jump. "I've got you," he said quietly, and she believed him. His chest was warm and solid under her palms, his heart beating steady and strong beneath her fingers, as feeling began to return in sharp tingles. Snow swirled around them in a white cocoon, and she was intensely aware that she was touching his bare skin, that they were standing far too close, that his hands were wrapped around hers in a way that felt like more than just warming frozen fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. For being foolish enough to get caught in the storm? Or for the way her breath had gone shallow? For the way she couldn't stop staring at him? "Don't be sorry," Nathan said, and his voice had gone rough in a way that sent shivers through her that had nothing to do with cold. "Just hold on." His thumbs were moving gently over the backs of her hands, rubbing circulation back into them, and she thought she might die from the intimacy of it. She'd been alone for 2 years. 2 years since the fever took Reverend Coleman and left her a widow at 27. 2 years of being proper and respected and desperately lonely. And now here was Nathan Cordell, the quiet sheriff who'd lost his own wife 3 years back, who'd been kind and distant and carefully appropriate with her, holding her hands against his bare chest like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he'd rip his shirt off in a blizzard without hesitation if it meant keeping her safe. The realization hit her like the storm, sudden and overwhelming. She was falling for him, had been falling for months, if she was honest. Every time he tipped his hat to her on the street, every time he checked on her ranch without being asked, every time he looked at her like she mattered. "Can you feel your hands?" he asked, and she nodded, not trusting her voice. She could feel them, could feel every inch of his skin under her palms, the heat and strength of him, the way his heart beat faster when she accidentally flexed her fingers. "Good," he said, but he didn't let go. They stood there in the snow, the storm raging around them, and something unspoken passed between them. Something that had been building for a long time. Then his horse stamped and whinnied, reminding them both that they were standing in a blizzard, and Nathan blinked like he was coming out of a trance. He released her hands and grabbed his coat, pulling it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled like leather and wood smoke and something. Distinctly him. "We need to get you somewhere warm," he said, his voice back to business even as his eyes lingered on her face. "My cabin's closer than your ranch house. Can you ride?" She nodded, though her legs felt weak for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. He lifted her onto his horse like she weighed nothing, his hands firm on her waist, and then swung up behind her. His arm came around her middle, pulling her back against his chest, and she could feel the heat of him even through her layers and his coat. He kicked the gelding into motion, and they pushed through the storm, his body sheltering hers from the worst of the wind. She should have been terrified, should have been focused on the danger, on how close she'd come to dying out there. Instead, all she could think about was the man behind her, the strength of his arm around her, the way he'd torn his shirt open without hesitation, the way he'd looked at her like she was precious, like she was worth saving. Nathan's cabin appeared through the snow like a blessing, small and solid with smoke rising from the chimney. He'd left a fire burning when he rode out searching for her. He dismounted and lifted her down, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment too long before he led her inside. The warmth hit her like a wall, and she swayed. He caught her, steadied her, guided her to the chair by the fire. The cabin was small but well kept, everything in its place. A man's space, simple and functional, but clean. She saw a shelf of books, a rifle over the door, a photograph on the mantel of a smiling, dark-haired woman she knew must be his late wife. "Stay by the fire," he ordered gently, already moving to the stove. "I'll make coffee." He'd put his torn shirt back on but hadn't buttoned it, and she could still see glimpses of his chest as he moved. She forced herself to look away, to focus on warming her hands by the flames, but her mind kept replaying the moment he'd ripped that shirt open. The fierce determination in his eyes. He brought her coffee in a tin cup, the steam rising between them. Their fingers brushed when she took it, and the contact sent electricity up her arm. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You saved my life." Nathan settled into the chair across from her, his own coffee in hand, and looked at her with those steady blue eyes. "You shouldn't have gone out in this," he said. But there was no judgment in his voice, only concern. "What were you thinking?" She wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth, and sighed. "Jackson Reeves cut my fence wire again. 3rd time this month. My cattle were getting through. I couldn't afford to lose them." At the mention of Reeves, Nathan's jaw tightened. "He's been escalating," she continued, her voice bitter. "First, it was just intimidation. Riding past my property, making veiled threats about how a woman shouldn't be running a ranch alone. Then, he started with the fence cutting. Last week, someone left a dead calf on my porch with a note that said I should sell before something worse happens." Nathan set his cup down with careful control, but she could see the anger in the set of his shoulders. "You should have told me," he said. "I'm the sheriff. Protecting people is my job." Something about the way he said it, like she was just another citizen to protect, stung more than it should have. "I can handle Jackson Reeves," she said, lifting her chin. "I've been handling everything else alone for 2 years." His eyes flashed. "And look where that got you today. Another hour in that storm and I'd have found you frozen." The words hung between them, brutal and true. She looked down at her hands, still pink from the cold, and felt tears prick her eyes. She was so tired. Tired of being strong. Tired of doing everything herself. Tired of men like Reeves, who thought a widow was easy prey. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You're right. I should have asked for help." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and moved closer, kneeling beside her chair so they were eye level. "Margaret," he said, and her name in his deep voice did things to her heart. "I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm trying to keep you alive. Reeves is dangerous. He's got money and influence, and he doesn't care who he hurts to get what he wants. Your ranch sits on prime grazing land with water rights he needs for his expansion. He won't stop until he has it, or until someone stops him." She met his eyes and saw genuine concern there, mixed with something else, something that made her breath catch. "Will you help me?" she asked quietly. "Will you help me stop him?" Nathan's hand came up, almost unconsciously, and tucked a strand of her honey blonde hair behind her ear. His fingertips brushed her cheek, and she inhaled sharply. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe," he said, and the promise in his voice was more than professional duty. It was personal. It was everything she'd been afraid to hope for. The storm raged outside for hours. Nathan made them supper, simple fare of bacon and beans and cornbread he'd baked that morning, and they ate in companionable silence. She watched him move around his cabin, economical and capable, and thought about how different he was from her late husband. Reverend Coleman had been a good man, devoted to his flock, but soft and scholarly. He'd left the physical labor to others and spent his days with books and prayer. There'd been affection between them, respect, but not passion. Not this electric awareness that made her skin feel too tight. Nathan Cordell was all lean muscle and quiet competence. A man who could track through a blizzard and tear his shirt open without hesitation. Who cooked his own meals and kept his own house. A man who looked at her like she was a woman, not just a respectable widow to be treated with distant courtesy. When full dark fell, Nathan stood and looked out the window at the still raging storm. "It's not letting up," he said. "You'll have to stay here tonight. You can have the bed. I'll take the floor by the fire." Propriety said she should protest, should insist on somehow getting back to her own ranch despite the deadly weather. But Margaret was done with propriety, done with pretending she was fine when she was drowning. "Nathan," she said, and he turned to face her. In the firelight, his features were all strong angles and shadows, his auburn hair burnished copper, his blue eyes dark and intense. "Thank you. For today. For all of it." He crossed to her in 2 strides, and for a moment she thought he might touch her again, might finish what had started in the snow, but he stopped himself, his hands flexing at his sides. "Get some rest, Margaret," he said, his voice rough. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do about Reeves. Tonight, just rest." She nodded and moved toward his bedroom, but at the doorway, she paused and looked back. He was standing by the fire, still shirtless, under his open coat, staring into the flames. The photograph of his late wife caught the firelight on the mantel, and Margaret felt a pang of something like guilt. They were both still mourning, both still carrying the weight of love and loss. Was it too soon? Was she betraying her husband's memory by wanting this man so badly she could taste it? But then, she thought of the way Nathan had looked at her today. The fierce protectiveness, the gentleness, the way he'd literally given her the warmth of his body to save her life. Whatever this was between them, it was real. And she was tired of being cold. She slept fitfully in Nathan's bed, wrapped in quilts that smelled like him, listening to the storm howl outside and the quiet sounds of him moving in the main room. When dawn came gray and cold, the blizzard had finally blown itself out, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. She emerged from the bedroom to find Nathan already up, dressed properly now in a clean shirt and vest, making coffee. He looked up when she entered, and something soft passed across his face. "Morning," he said. "Storm's over. I'll ride you back to your ranch after breakfast." She nodded, suddenly awkward in the morning light, the intensity of yesterday feeling like maybe it had been her imagination. But then he poured her coffee, and their fingers brushed again. And the heat was still there, undeniable. The ride back to her ranch took twice as long as it should have, the snow deep and treacherous. When they finally arrived, Margaret's heart sank. Her fence line was destroyed, not just cut but torn down completely, posts pulled up and scattered. And in the snow by her barn, someone had written in letters 3 feet tall, "Sell or burn." Nathan's face went hard as stone. He dismounted and walked slowly around her property, reading the tracks in the fresh snow. 4 men, he said finally, came during the storm. This wasn't Reeves himself, but it was his men. I recognized the boot print of one of them. Jake Morrison. He works for Reeves. Margaret stared at the threatening message in the snow and felt something break inside her. She'd tried so hard to keep this place, to honor her husband's memory by maintaining what they'd built together. But maybe she was being foolish. Maybe a woman alone really couldn't hold on to a ranch when a man like Jackson Reeves wanted it. Nathan must have seen something in her face, because suddenly, he was there, his hands on her shoulders, turning her to face him. Don't, he said firmly. Don't you dare give up. That's what he wants. He wants you scared and helpless and ready to sell for pennies on the dollar. She looked up at him and felt tears threaten. What am I supposed to do, Nathan? I can't fight him alone. I don't have the money for lawyers or hired men. I can barely keep up with the ranch work as it is. His hands tightened on her shoulders and his blue eyes blazed. You're not alone, he said. Not anymore. I'm with you. We'll fight him together. The way he said it, the certainty in his voice, made her want to believe, made her want to lean into him and let him carry some of this crushing weight. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk going against Jackson Reeves for me? He's the richest man in the county. He could destroy your career. Nathan's jaw worked, like he was wrestling with something. Then he reached up and cupped her face in his hand, his palm rough and warm against her cold cheek. Because when I thought I might lose you yesterday, he said, his voice dropping low and rough. When I thought I might find you frozen in that snow, something in me broke, Margaret. I've been half alive since I lost Emily, going through the motions, doing my duty, but not really living. And then you came to Stone Valley 2 years ago, and you looked at me with those warm brown eyes, and you smiled at me after church, and something in me started to wake up. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was too soon, that we were both still mourning. But yesterday, holding you, feeling your frozen hands against my chest, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I care about you, Margaret, more than I should, more than is probably proper. But I'm done pretending I don't. The world seemed to stop. Margaret stared up at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that he'd said too much, revealed too much. And she thought about how lonely the last 2 years had been, how heavy the burden of being strong and proper and alone, how much she'd wanted someone to see her, really see her, not as a respectable widow or a struggling rancher, but as a woman. As Margaret. I care about you too, she whispered, and watched relief flood his face. I have for months, but I didn't think you felt the same. You were always so careful, so distant. He laughed, a rough sound. I was trying to be respectful, trying to give you space, trying not to push too hard or too fast. But damn it, Margaret, I can't watch Reeves terrorize you and do nothing. I can't stand by and let him take everything from you. Not when I have the power to stop him. She reached up and covered his hand with hers, the one still cupping her cheek. What do we do? She asked. Nathan's expression turned determined. First, I'm going to arrest Jake Morrison and the other men who did this. Make them testify that Reeves ordered it. Then I'm going to pay Mr. Reeves a visit and make it very clear that if he comes near you or your property again, he'll answer to me. And if that doesn't work, we'll take it to the territorial judge. Your property rights are legal and documented. He can't just force you out because he wants your land. It sounded simple when he said it. Logical. But Margaret knew Jackson Reeves didn't play by rules. He'll retaliate, she said. Against you. He has connections. He could have you removed as sheriff. Nathan smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Let him try. I've got connections of my own. And I've got something he doesn't have. What's that? She asked. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I've got the truth," he said, "and I've got you." The next week was a whirlwind. Nathan arrested Jake Morrison and 2 other men, based on their boot prints and testimony from a neighbor who'd seen them riding toward Margaret's ranch during the storm. Under pressure, Morrison admitted that Jackson Reeves had paid them to harass Mrs. Coleman and destroy her property. With that testimony, Nathan rode out to Reeves's sprawling ranch, the biggest spread in the county, and confronted the man himself. Margaret insisted on coming along, and Nathan, after a long look at her determined face, agreed. They sat in Reeves' study, all dark wood and leather and expensive whiskey, while the man himself lounged behind his desk like a king on a throne. Jackson Reeves was in his 50s, silver-haired and distinguished, with cold green eyes and a smile that never reached them. "Sheriff Cordell," he said smoothly, "and Mrs. Coleman, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Nathan placed the written confessions on Reeves' desk. "Your men have confessed to destroying Mrs. Coleman's property on your orders. That's criminal trespass, vandalism, and intimidation. I could arrest you right now." Reeves barely glanced at the papers. "Boys will be boys, Sheriff. Perhaps they got a little overzealous. I'll pay for the damages, of course. Let's call it a misunderstanding and move on." His smile was all teeth. "In fact, I'll do better than that. Mrs. Coleman, I'll buy your ranch. Fair market value, cash payment. You can move to town, live comfortably. No more struggling to manage a property that's clearly too much for a woman alone." Margaret felt Nathan tense beside her, but she spoke before he could. "My ranch is not for sale, Mr. Reeves. Not now, not ever. My husband and I built that place from nothing. It's my home, and I'm perfectly capable of managing it." Reeves' smile vanished. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Coleman. I'm trying to be reasonable here, but there are limits to my patience." Nathan stood, and even sitting, Reeves had to look up at him. "Let me be clear," Nathan said, his voice deadly quiet. "If you or any of your men set foot on Mrs. Coleman's property again, I'll arrest you. If anything happens to her ranch, her livestock, or her person, I'll know exactly where to look. And if you think your money and influence will protect you, think again. I've already filed charges with the territorial marshal. He's very interested in your business practices. Turns out, you're not the only rancher in the county who's been experiencing mysterious problems when they won't sell to you." Reeves' face darkened. "You're making powerful enemies, Sheriff. That badge won't protect you forever." Nathan leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "Neither will your money, Reeves. Stay away from her. That's your only warning." They left Reeves' ranch with Margaret's heart in her throat. "He won't stop," she said as they rode back toward town. "You know that, right? Men like him don't back down." Nathan glanced at her, his jaw set. "Then neither do we." "Margaret, I meant what I said. I'm with you in this, whatever comes." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that Nathan's protection would be enough. But she'd seen the cold calculation in Jackson Reeves' eyes. He was a man who took what he wanted, and he wanted her land. That night, Nathan insisted on staying at her ranch, sleeping in her barn to keep watch. Margaret protested that it wasn't proper, that people would talk. But he fixed her with a look that brooked no argument. "I don't care what people say," he told her. "I care about keeping you alive. Reeves is angry now, cornered. That makes him dangerous." So Nathan bedded down in her barn with his rifle and his horse, and Margaret lay in her own bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing he was just yards away, standing guard over her in the cold. 3 days later, she woke to the smell of smoke. She bolted from bed and ran outside in her nightgown and bare feet, and her heart stopped. Her barn was on fire, flames licking up the sides, smoke billowing black into the pre-dawn sky. "Nathan!" she screamed, running toward the inferno. Oh God, Nathan was in there. She had to get him out. She'd barely made it halfway across the yard when a figure stumbled out of the smoke, coughing and soot-covered, leading 2 panicked horses. Nathan. He was alive. Relief made her legs weak. He saw her, and his eyes went wide. "Margaret, stay back!" he shouted, but she was already running to him. He handed off the horses and turned back toward the barn. "There's more stock inside," he said, already moving. "Nathan!" "No!" She grabbed his arm. "It's not safe." He looked down at her, his face grim and determined. "I have to try. That's your livelihood in there." And before she could stop him, he wrapped a wet cloth over his face and dove back into the burning barn. Margaret stood frozen in horror, watching the flames grow higher, listening to the crash of falling timbers. Seconds felt like hours. Then Nathan appeared again, herding out her milk cow and 2 more horses, his clothes singed, his face black with soot. He collapsed to his knees in the snow, coughing violently, and Margaret ran to him, her hands on his face, his shoulders, checking for injuries. "You could have died," she said, and her voice broke. "You could have died for a barn." Nathan looked up at her, his blue eyes blazing through the soot on his face. "Not for a barn," he said roughly. "For you. Everything in that barn was yours. I couldn't let it burn." Behind them, the barn collapsed with a groaning crash, sending sparks into the morning sky. Margaret's neighbors arrived, drawn by the smoke, and formed a bucket line to keep the fire from spreading to her house. By full morning, it was over. The barn was a smoking ruin, but her house and animals were saved. And Nathan had saved them. It was arson, of course. Nathan found evidence of kerosene and deliberately set fires in 3 different locations. Jackson Reeves had escalated from intimidation to attempted murder. If Nathan hadn't been there, if he hadn't woken in time, Margaret would have burned alive in her bed. The realization made her shake. That night, Nathan didn't even pretend to maintain propriety. "You're coming to my cabin," he said flatly. "You're not staying here alone with your barn destroyed and that bastard on the loose. Pack a bag. Now." Margaret didn't argue. She was too shaken, too grateful he was alive, too aware of how close they'd both come to dying. She threw clothes and necessities into a carpet bag and let him lift her onto his horse. They rode through the snow to his cabin, and when he helped her down, his hands lingered on her waist. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect your barn. I should have been more alert, should have heard them sooner." Margaret looked up at him in the fading light. This man who'd risked his life for her property, who'd run into a burning building without hesitation, and something inside her broke open. "You saved my life," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my animals. You almost died for me, Nathan. Don't you dare apologize." His hands tightened on her waist, and she saw the war in his eyes, the desire and the restraint. "Margaret," he said, and her name was almost a groan. If you keep looking at me like that, I'm going to forget every rule of propriety I've ever known." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing through the soot still smudged on his cheek. "Maybe I want you to forget," she whispered. For a moment, Nathan went absolutely still. Then, he pulled her against him and kissed her like a man drowning, like she was air and water and salvation all at once. His mouth claimed hers with a hunger that stole her breath, his arms wrapping around her and lifting her against him. Margaret melted into the kiss, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body pressed along the length of his. She'd been kissed before, but never like this. Never with this consuming need, this desperate passion. Nathan kissed her like he'd been thinking about it for months, like he'd been holding back and couldn't anymore, like she was precious and desired and necessary. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard, their breath visible in white clouds in the cold air. "Inside," he said roughly, "before I scandalize you in my front yard." He picked up her bag and led her into the cabin, and the moment the door closed behind them, he was kissing her again, backing her against the wall, his body hot and solid against hers. "Nathan," she gasped between kisses, and he pulled back, his eyes searching her face. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice ragged. "Tell me this is too fast, that you're not ready, and I'll stop right now. I'll be a perfect gentleman. I'll give you the bed and sleep by the fire and never touch you again if that's what you want." Margaret looked at this good man, this honorable man who was giving her the choice even though she could feel how much he wanted her. She thought about the last 2 years of loneliness, of being cold and afraid and alone. She thought about how he'd torn his shirt open in a blizzard to warm her hands, how he'd stood up to Jackson Reeves for her, how he'd run into a burning barn to save her livelihood. She thought about how alive she felt in his arms, how warm, how wanted. "Don't stop," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Don't be a gentleman. I don't want you to stop." Something blazed in his eyes, fierce and possessive. "You're sure?" he asked. "Because once I start, Margaret, I'm not going to want to let you go." She pulled him down to her and kissed him with everything she had. "Then don't let go," she whispered against his lips. "Never let go." What happened next was tender and urgent, passionate and gentle. Everything she'd never known she needed. Nathan carried her to his bed and loved her slowly, thoroughly, his hands and mouth worshiping every inch of her like she was something sacred. He was patient and generous, making sure she found pleasure before taking his own, and when they finally came together, it felt like something more than just bodies joining. It felt like two lonely souls finding home in each other. Afterwards, she lay in his arms, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow, and felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Hey," Nathan said softly, wiping them away with his thumb. "What's wrong? Did I hurt you?" She shook her head, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. "Then what?" he asked, concern filling his voice. She took a shaky breath. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again," she whispered. "After my husband died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I'd spend the rest of my days alone, going through the motions. And then, you happened, and I feel alive again, Nathan. So alive it terrifies me." He turned on his side and pulled her closer, his hand stroking through her honey blonde hair. "I know," he said quietly. "After Emily died, I told myself I'd never love anyone again. It hurt too much to lose her. I couldn't survive that kind of pain twice. So I kept everyone at arm's length. Did my job. Went through my days. But I was just existing, not living. Then you smiled at me after church one Sunday, and something in my chest cracked open. I tried to ignore it. Tried to stay away. But the more I saw you, the more I wanted to know you. And the more I knew you, the more I fell." He cupped her face in his hand, his blue eyes serious in the firelight. "I love you, Margaret. I know it's fast. I know we should probably take more time. But I'm done wasting time. Life's too short and too uncertain. I love you, and I want to spend whatever days I have left making you happy." Fresh tears spilled over and she kissed him, pouring everything she felt into it. "I love you too," she said against his mouth. "I love you so much it scares me." They stayed wrapped in each other as the fire burned low and the winter night deepened around the cabin. For the first time in years, Margaret felt safe, protected, cherished. Nathan's arms around her were strong and sure, and she let herself believe, just for this moment, that everything would be all right. That love could conquer even men like Jackson Reeves. That she'd found her home not in a piece of land, but in this man who held her like she was everything. But as dawn crept through the windows, reality returned with it. Her barn was destroyed. Reeves was still a threat, and now she and Nathan had crossed a line that society would judge harshly. A widow and a widower, spending the night together, unmarried, would cause scandal in a town like Stone Valley. People would talk. The church ladies would gossip. Her reputation, carefully maintained these last 2 years, would be in tatters. Nathan seemed to read her thoughts. "Marry me," he said suddenly, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. "Today. Right now. We'll ride to the preacher and make it legal." Margaret blinked up at him, her heart jumping. "That's not a proposal," she said with a small smile. "That's a command." He had the grace to look sheepish. "You're right. I'm doing this badly." He took her hand in his thumb, rubbing circles on her palm. "Margaret Coleman, you're the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. You make me want to be a better man. You make me feel alive again. I know we haven't courted properly. I know this is fast. But I also know that I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to protect you and provide for you and build a future with you. I want children with you, if God blesses us that way. I want to grow old with you. So will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a broken-down sheriff who loves you more than he thought possible?" Margaret felt her eyes fill again, but these were happy tears. She thought about propriety, about taking time, about what people would say. And then she thought about how short life was, how quickly everything could be taken away. She thought about Nathan running into a burning barn for her, about him tearing his shirt open in a blizzard, about the way he looked at her like she hung the moon. "Yes," she said, her voice catching. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married that afternoon by Reverend Thomas in Stone Valley's small white church, with only the Reverend's wife and Nathan's deputy as witnesses. Margaret wore her best dress, dark blue wool with her mother's cameo at the throat, and Nathan wore his Sunday suit, his auburn hair slicked back, his blue eyes never leaving her face. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Nathan kissed her gently, sweetly, a promise of all the kisses to come. They filed the marriage certificate at the county office, making it official and legal, and Nathan moved Margaret's few possessions from her damaged ranch to his cabin. "Our cabin now," he corrected, when she called it his. "Our home." That night, they lay together as husband and wife, and everything felt different, more settled, more right. This wasn't scandal or impropriety. This was marriage. This was building a life together. The next morning, Nathan pinned on his badge and kissed Margaret goodbye. "I need to file additional charges against Reeves for the arson," he said. "And I want to check on your ranch, see what needs rebuilding." She walked him to the door, still marveling at the gold band on her finger. "Be careful," she said. "Reeves is desperate now. He knows you're not backing down." Nathan cupped her face and kissed her thoroughly. "I'll be careful. You stay here where it's safe. Lock the door. My deputy knows you're here if you need anything." But Margaret had never been good at sitting idle. Once Nathan left, she bundled up against the cold and walked into town to the general store. She needed supplies, needed to start thinking about rebuilding, needed to keep busy so she wouldn't worry about her new husband confronting a dangerous man. The store was warm and crowded with other ranch wives doing their shopping. The moment Margaret walked in, conversation stopped. She felt every eye turned to her, saw the shock and speculation on their faces. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, was the first to speak. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Or should I say Mrs. Cordell now? My, that was sudden, wasn't it? Married yesterday afternoon with barely any notice. One does wonder about such haste." The implication was clear. The other women tittered behind their hands. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her head high. "Sheriff Cordell and I have known each other for some time," she said evenly. "We saw no reason to wait." Mrs. Patterson, an older woman who'd always been kind to Margaret, spoke up. "Congratulations, dear. Nathan Cordell is a good man. You deserve happiness." But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. "Of course, with your barn burning down and you spending the night at the sheriff's cabin, marriage was rather necessary to preserve your reputation, wasn't it? How convenient." Margaret's temper flared. She dealt with this woman's condescension for 2 years, endured her barely veiled insults about how improper it was for a woman to run a ranch alone. But she was done being polite. "My reputation," Margaret said clearly, her voice carrying through the store, "is intact. Sheriff Cordell is an honorable man who treated me with nothing but respect until we were properly wed." "If you're implying otherwise, Mrs. Henderson, you should be very careful. My husband doesn't take kindly to people spreading lies about his wife." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Mrs. Henderson's face went red. "Well, I never," she huffed. "The audacity." But Margaret saw the flash of fear in the woman's eyes. Nathan Cordell might be patient and kind, but he was still the sheriff, and he had a reputation for being absolutely unyielding when it came to justice. Mrs. Patterson smiled and patted Margaret's arm. "Don't mind her, dear. She's just jealous. Half the women in town have been hoping to catch Nathan's eye since his wife passed. You got the prize." Margaret managed to smile, though her hands were shaking. She completed her shopping quickly and headed back to the cabin, her good mood thoroughly soured. When Nathan returned that evening, she was making dinner, or trying to. Her cooking skills were adequate, but not inspired. and she was wrestling with a stubborn roast that refused to cooperate. Nathan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against him. "Smells good," he lied, and she laughed despite her frustration. "Liar. It smells like I'm murdering an innocent piece of meat." He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest into her back. "I've had worse. Besides, I married you for your ranch management skills and your pretty eyes, not your cooking." She turned in his arms and saw the exhaustion on his face. "What happened?" she asked. He sighed and kissed her forehead. "I filed the arson charges. The territorial marshal is coming next week to investigate, but Reeves is fighting back. He's hired a fancy lawyer from Portland, and he's claiming you set the fire yourself for the insurance money. Says you were desperate to get out from under the property, and that I helped you do it because we were, and I quote, carrying on an illicit affair." Margaret felt sick. "That's insane. I loved that barn. My husband built it with his own hands." Nathan's arms tightened around her. "I know, and the marshal will know too once he investigates. The evidence clearly shows arson, and Reeves' men's boot prints were all over your property. But it's going to get ugly, Margaret. Reeves is trying to destroy both our reputations." She thought about Mrs. Henderson's insinuations at the general store. "It's already starting," she said quietly, and told him about the encounter. Nathan's jaw clenched. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry you have to deal with gossip and judgment because of me." She reached up and touched his face. "Because of us," she corrected. "And I don't care what they say, Nathan. I have you. That's all that matters." But it did matter, whether she wanted it to or not. Over the next few days, the gossip intensified. People whispered when Margaret walked by. Some of the church ladies stopped inviting her to their socials. Even Reverend Thomas seemed uncomfortable when Nathan and Margaret attended Sunday service, though he was too kind to say anything directly. Margaret held her head high and Nathan's hand tight, but she could feel the weight of the town's judgment. It hurt more than she wanted to admit. She'd worked hard to be respectable, to honor her late husband's memory, to be a good Christian woman. Now people were looking at her like she was fallen, like she was something shameful. Nathan saw her pain even when she tried to hide it. One night, he pulled her into his lap by the fire and held her close. "I hate that you're going through this," he said against her hair. "I hate that loving me has cost you your standing in the community." Margaret turned to face him, her hands on his chest. "It hasn't cost me anything that matters," she said firmly. "Those people who are judging us, they don't know the truth. They don't know that you saved my life, that you've protected me, that you've been nothing but honorable. And if they can't see what a good man you are, then their opinion doesn't matter." He smiled, but it was sad. "You're a better person than I am. If I'm honest, I'd like to punch about half the town right now." She laughed, the sound surprising her. "Mrs. Henderson first?" she suggested. "Absolutely, Mrs. Henderson first," he agreed. Right in her judgmental nose. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling, the winter wind howling outside. Then, Nathan said quietly, "I checked on your ranch today. The barn's a total loss, but the foundation is still good. We could rebuild come spring. Or," he paused, his hand rubbing her back, "or we could sell it. Use the money to expand my property here, build a bigger house, start fresh. No more target on your back from Reeves. No more reminders of everything you lost. Margaret considered it. Part of her wanted to cling to that land, to the home she'd built with her first husband, to the legacy of their brief time together. But another part of her, a growing part, recognized that clinging to the past was keeping her from fully embracing the future. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that you should do whatever feels right to you. If you want to keep the ranch and rebuild, I'll help you. We'll make it work. But if you want to let it go, if you want to start fresh with me here, that's okay too. I just want you happy, Margaret. The rest is details." She leaned her head against his shoulder and thought about it. Really thought about it. That ranch had been her whole world for 2 years. She'd poured her sweat and tears into it. But it had never really felt like home. Not the way this cabin did with Nathan in it. Home wasn't about land or buildings. It was about the person you shared them with. "Let's sell it," she said finally. "Use the money to build our future, not preserve my past. I'm ready to move forward." She felt him relax against her and knew it was the answer he'd hoped for. The territorial marshal arrived the following week, a grizzled man named Pierce, who'd been doing his job for 20 years and had seen every trick in the book. He spent 3 days investigating, examining the burned barn, interviewing witnesses, reviewing the confessions of Reeves' men. Nathan took him through everything methodically. Every piece of evidence, every threat, every escalation. Margaret testified about the intimidation, the fence cutting, the threatening notes. Pierce listened to it all with an impassive face that gave nothing away. When Reeves' fancy lawyer tried to spin it as a desperate woman and her lover staging an insurance fraud, Pierce actually laughed. "Son," he said to the lawyer, "I've been investigating fires for 2 decades. This was arson, plain and simple. Kerosene-soaked rags in 3 locations. Set to burn fast and hot. Professional job. And Mrs. Cordell here," he nodded to Margaret, "was asleep in her house when it started. She'd have burned alive if Sheriff Cordell hadn't been standing watch. So unless you're suggesting she tried to kill herself for insurance money, your theory doesn't hold water." The lawyer sputtered and tried a different tack, but Pierce shut him down with the kind of authority that came from years of being the law in wild territories. By the end of the week, he'd filed a formal report recommending Jackson Reeves be arrested and tried for arson, attempted murder, criminal intimidation, and conspiracy. "It'll take time," Pierce warned Nathan and Margaret. "Legal proceedings move slow, and Reeves has money for appeals. But the evidence is solid. He'll answer for this." Nathan shook the marshal's hand. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate you taking this seriously." Pierce looked between Nathan and Margaret, his weathered face creasing in something like a smile. "For what it's worth, Sheriff, you did good work here. Most lawmen wouldn't have gone up against the richest man in the county. Takes guts. Or love." He tipped his hat to Margaret. "Ma'am, you've got yourself a good man. Don't let the gossips tell you otherwise." After Pierce left, Margaret felt like she could breathe for the first time in weeks. Reeves was going to face justice. The threat was diminishing. They could start to build a real life together without constantly looking over their shoulders. But Jackson Reeves wasn't going down without a fight. 2 days after Marshal Pierce filed his report, Nathan came home with a grim expression. "What is it?" Margaret asked immediately. He pulled her down to sit beside him at their table. "The county commissioners held an emergency meeting today. Reeves called in every favor he's accumulated over the years. They're voting tomorrow on whether to remove me as sheriff, pending an investigation into alleged corruption and abuse of power. Reeves is claiming I've been persecuting him because of my personal relationship with you, that I've falsified evidence, coerced confessions, and violated his rights." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "They can't do that. You've done everything by the book. Marshal Pierce verified all your evidence." Nathan's smile was bitter. "Politics doesn't care about evidence, Margaret. Reeves has been lining these men's pockets for years. He's calling in his debts. Even if they don't remove me permanently, they can suspend me while they investigate, and that could take months." She grabbed his hand, holding tight. "What do we do?" He looked at her, his blue eyes dark with worry. "We fight. I've requested to speak at the meeting tomorrow. I'll present everything to the commissioners publicly, make them look the town in the eye, while they decide whether justice or money matters more." End quote. The next evening, the town hall was packed. Word had spread about the commissioners' vote, and everyone wanted to see what would happen. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands clenched in her lap, watching Nathan stand before the 5 commissioners with his back straight and his badge gleaming on his chest. He presented his case methodically, laying out every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every documented threat. He showed the confessions of Reeves's men, Marshal Pierce's official report, the physical evidence from Margaret's barn. His voice was steady and clear, and Margaret had never been more proud of anyone in her life. When he finished, Jackson Reeves stood to rebut. He was smooth and polished, painting himself as a victim of a sheriff who'd let personal feelings cloud his judgment. He suggested that Nathan had been so desperate to impress his new wife that he'd manufactured a case against an innocent man. He reminded the commissioners of all the jobs his ranch provided, all the money he brought into the county, all the charitable donations he'd made over the years. The implication was clear. Fire Nathan Cordell, and all that generosity would continue. Keep him and face economic consequences. The commissioners deliberated for an hour. Margaret sat frozen, praying harder than she'd prayed in years. Finally, they returned. Commissioner Jameson, the eldest, spoke. "We've reviewed the evidence presented by Sheriff Cordell and the statements from Mr. Reeves. This is a difficult situation, as both men are respected members of our community." Margaret's heart sank. She knew that tone. It was the tone of a man about to choose money over justice. But then, Jameson continued, "However, we cannot ignore the documented evidence, the confessions of multiple witnesses, and the official report from Territorial Marshal Pierce. While Mr. Reeves's contributions to our county are appreciated, they do not place him above the law." Margaret's breath caught. Was he actually going to rule in Nathan's favor? "Therefore," Jameson said, "we find no grounds to remove Sheriff Cordell from his position. The evidence suggests he acted appropriately within his authority. Mr. Reeves, you will answer to the charges filed against you in territorial court. This commission will not interfere with the legal process. Sheriff Cordell, you are ordered to continue your duties and maintain the peace in Stone Valley. This hearing is adjourned." The room erupted in noise. Some people cheered. Others shouted in protest. Margaret didn't hear any of it. She was already pushing through the crowd to Nathan, who looked stunned. When she reached him, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "We won," she whispered against his chest. "You won, Nathan. Justice won." He buried his face in her hair. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said roughly. "Without you standing beside me, believing in me. You make me braver than I am alone." They held each other in the chaos of the town hall, an island of calm in the storm, and Margaret felt the last of her fear ease. They'd faced down the richest, most powerful man in the county, and won. Together, they could face anything. As they left the building, walking hand in hand toward their horse, Jackson Reeves stepped out of the shadows. His face was a mask of cold fury. "This isn't over, Sheriff," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've made an enemy tonight. And I'm a patient man. Someday, when you least expect it, you'll pay for this." Nathan stepped in front of Margaret, shielding her with his body. "Stay away from my wife, Reeves. And stay away from me. You're going to trial. If you're smart, you'll use the time before then to make peace with your conscience." Reeves laughed, a cold sound. "Conscience? Sheriff, I stopped worrying about my conscience years ago. Out here, only the strong survive. And you've just proven you're strong enough to be a real threat. That's a dangerous thing to be." He tipped his hat mockingly and disappeared into the night. Margaret shivered, and not from the cold. "He's going to retaliate," she said quietly. Nathan's arm came around her shoulders. "Let him try. He's facing criminal charges now. He makes one wrong move and he'll be in a cell. He's not stupid enough to risk that." But Margaret wasn't so sure. Men like Jackson Reeves didn't think like normal people. They thought they were untouchable, that the rules didn't apply to them, and when they were cornered, they became most dangerous. The next few weeks passed in tense anticipation. Reeves stayed away from them both, conducting his business and preparing for trial. The town slowly began to accept Margaret and Nathan's marriage, especially after Mrs. Patterson and some of the other kinder women made it clear they supported the union. The gossip died down to manageable levels. Margaret sold her ranch to a young couple from back east, getting a fair price that gave her and Nathan a solid financial foundation. With the money, they began planning additions to Nathan's cabin. A proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, maybe eventually a nursery, if God blessed them with children. Margaret threw herself into making their home comfortable, sewing curtains, planting bulbs for a spring garden, learning to cook Nathan's favorite meals. It felt good to have a purpose beyond survival, to be building something with someone she loved. Nathan continued his work as sheriff, and Margaret often brought him lunch at his office, enjoying the way the townspeople were starting to see them as a respectable married couple rather than a scandal. One afternoon in late February, Margaret was in the general store when she overheard two men talking in low voices. "Heard Reeves is planning something," one said. "His trial starts next week, and he's not going quietly. Word is he's hired some men from out of territory. Rough types, gunslingers." The other man grunted. "Cordell better watch his back. Reeves don't forgive, and he don't forget." Margaret's blood ran cold. She abandoned her shopping and ran to Nathan's office, bursting through the door breathless. "Margaret?" Nathan stood from his desk, concern immediately crossing his face. "What's wrong?" She told him what she'd overheard. Nathan's expression went grim. "I've heard similar rumors," he admitted. "My deputy's been keeping ears open. Reeves brought in 3 men a few days ago. They're staying at his ranch. Their descriptions match known hired guns from down south." Margaret grabbed his arms. "Nathan, you have to be careful. If he's hired killers, if he's planning to hurt you." He pulled her close. "I know. I'm being cautious, I promise. I don't go anywhere without my gun, and I've told my deputy to stay alert. But Margaret, you need to be careful too. If Reeves can't get to me directly, he might try to hurt me through you." The thought terrified her. Maybe I should leave town for a while. Visit family back east until this is over. Nathan shook his head firmly. "No, I need you here where I can protect you. Besides, running would just prove to Reeves that fear works. We stay. We stand firm. Together." That night, Nathan made sure every window in their cabin was locked, every door barred. He kept his rifle loaded by the bed and his pistol on the nightstand. Margaret tried to sleep, but kept jerking awake at every small sound, her heart racing. The trial began the following Monday. The territorial courthouse in Stone Valley was packed with spectators. Jackson Reeves sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, looking calm and confident, his fancy lawyer beside him. The prosecutor was a solid man named Warren, appointed by the territorial government specifically to handle cases involving wealthy defendants who might otherwise escape justice. Margaret and Nathan sat in the front row of the gallery, holding hands. The trial lasted 3 days. Witness after witness testified about Reeves's intimidation tactics, his systematic campaign to drive Margaret off her land. Jake Morrison, who'd cut a deal to testify in exchange for a lighter sentence, described in detail how Reeves had paid him and others to destroy Margaret's fence, to leave threatening notes, and finally to burn her barn. The evidence was damning. Marshal Pierce took the stand and presented his findings, methodical and unshakable. Nathan testified about the pattern of escalation, the clear intent to harm. Margaret testified about her fear, about watching her barn burn, about nearly losing everything. The prosecutor was thorough and professional, building an ironclad case brick by brick. But Reeves' lawyer was good. He created doubt where he could, suggested that Morrison and the other men had acted on their own without Reeves' knowledge, painted his client as a successful businessman who'd been unfairly targeted by a sheriff with a grudge. He brought character witnesses who testified to Reeves's generosity and standing in the community. He made it seem almost plausible that this had all been a terrible misunderstanding. By the 3rd day, when closing arguments began, Margaret wasn't sure which way the jury would lean. The prosecutor gave a stirring closing argument about the rule of law, about how no man was above justice, about protecting innocent people from those who would use money and power to terrorize them. Reeves' lawyer countered with appeals to emotion, to loyalty to a pillar of the community, to reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they finally filed back in, Margaret's heart was in her throat. The foreman stood. "On the charge of criminal intimidation, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of destruction of property, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit arson, we find the defendant guilty." Margaret's hand tightened on Nathan's as the verdict continued. Guilty on every count. The judge, a stern man who'd traveled from the territorial capital, regarded Reeves with cold eyes. "Mr. Reeves, You have used your wealth and influence to terrorize innocent people. You have broken the laws you believe didn't apply to you. I hereby sentence you to 10 years in the territorial prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 5 years. Additionally, you are ordered to pay full restitution to Mrs. Cordell for the destruction of her property, plus punitive damages. Your assets will be reviewed, and if necessary, seized to ensure payment. Bailiff, take him into custody. 2 bailiffs stepped forward to restrain Reeves. For just a moment, his composure cracked, and he looked directly at Nathan with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Cordell," he said as they led him away. "You hear me? This isn't over." But his threats sounded hollow now, the desperate words of a defeated man. Nathan stood and pulled Margaret up with him, wrapping his arm around her waist. "It's over," he said quietly. "He can't hurt us anymore. He can't hurt anyone anymore." Margaret leaned into him, feeling the weight she'd carried for months finally lift. It was really over. Reeves was going to prison. She was safe. They were safe. That night, the town threw an impromptu celebration at the saloon. People who'd been whispering about Margaret and Nathan weeks before now toasted them, congratulated Nathan on his fine police work, welcomed Margaret warmly into their conversations. Mrs. Patterson hugged Margaret tight. "I'm so glad that's over, dear," she said. "You and Nathan can finally just be happy." Even Mrs. Henderson approached, looking slightly embarrassed. "I may have been hasty in my judgments, Mrs. Cordell," she said stiffly. "Your husband is clearly a credit to this town." It was as close to an apology as Margaret was going to get, but she accepted it graciously. As the celebration wound down and people headed home, Nathan and Margaret walked back to their cabin under a sky full of stars. The winter air was crisp and clean, the snow crunching under their boots, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret could just enjoy the beauty of the night, without fear shadowing every moment. Nathan's arm was around her shoulders, keeping her close, and she felt a contentment so deep it made her throat tight. "What are you thinking about?" Nathan asked softly, his breath visible in the cold air. She looked up at him, this strong, honorable man who'd stood beside her through everything. "I'm thinking about how much my life has changed," she said. 6 months ago, I was alone and terrified, trying to hold on to a piece of land while a powerful man tried to crush me. Now, I have you. I have a home. I have a future. It feels like a miracle." He stopped walking and turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face gently. "You're the miracle, Margaret. You could have given up so many times. Could have sold out to Reeves. Could have run away. Could have let fear win. But you stood your ground. You fought back. You're the bravest person I know." She rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. When they pulled apart, both breathing harder, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "Let's go home," he murmured. "Our home, and start living the life we fought so hard for." They made love that night, with a tenderness that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Every touch a celebration, every kiss a promise. Afterwards, wrapped in his arms in their bed, Margaret felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. Tomorrow, they would start planning their future in earnest. Tomorrow, they would begin building the additions to the cabin, planting the spring garden, making all the dreams they'd whispered about into reality. But tonight, she just wanted to be held by the man she loved, safe and warm, while the winter wind sang outside their window. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. Nathan's arms tightened around her. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I thought I could love anyone. You brought me back to life, Margaret. Gave me a reason to be more than just a man going through the motions. Thank you for taking a chance on me." She smiled against his chest. "Thank you for ripping your shirt open in a blizzard," she said, and felt him laugh, the sound rumbling through both of them. The winter began to ease as February turned to March. The snow started melting, revealing brown earth and the first brave shoots of green. Margaret and Nathan worked side by side expanding their cabin, Nathan doing the heavy construction while Margaret painted and decorated and made it feel like home. They hired a carpenter from town to help with the more complex work, and slowly their small cabin grew into a proper house with 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a front porch where they could sit on summer evenings. Margaret planted a garden, working the soil with her hands, feeling the promise of new life in every seed she placed. She planted vegetables for practical eating, but also flowers, roses and hollyhocks and sweet peas, because beauty mattered too. Because after so much darkness, she wanted color and life and growing things all around them. Nathan watched her work sometimes, leaning against the fence he'd built, a soft smile on his face that made her heart flutter. "What?" she'd ask, brushing dirt from her hands. "Just admiring my wife," he'd say. "Watching you build our future. It's a good sight." In April, Margaret realized she'd missed her monthly courses. At first, she thought it was just stress, her body still adjusting after everything they'd been through. But when she missed a second month and started feeling queasy in the mornings, she knew. She was carrying Nathan's child. The realization filled her with joy so intense, it frightened her. She'd always wanted children, had mourned when her first marriage remained childless, and now, at 29, she'd begun to think it might never happen. But here she was, pregnant, with a baby growing inside her that she and Nathan had created out of love. She wanted to tell him immediately, wanted to see his face light up with the news. But she also wanted to be sure, wanted to pick the perfect moment. So she waited a few more weeks, until there was no doubt. Until her body was definitely changing in all the small ways that confirmed new life. She chose a quiet evening, when Nathan came home tired from a long day dealing with a property dispute between 2 stubborn ranchers. She'd made his favorite dinner, roast chicken with potatoes and fresh bread. And she'd even managed to make a decent apple pie for dessert. Nathan ate with obvious appreciation, praising her cooking, which had improved considerably with practice. When they finished, Margaret took his hand and led him to sit on their new front porch. The spring evening was mild and beautiful, the air full of birdsong and the smell of growing things. "I have something to tell you," Margaret said, her heart pounding. Nathan looked at her, his blue eyes instantly concerned. "What is it? Are you all right?" She smiled and placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "I'm more than all right. Nathan, I'm carrying your child. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, he just stared at her, his hand motionless on her belly. Then his face transformed, joy flooding his features in a way that made him look years younger. "A baby?" he said, his voice breaking. "We're having a baby?" She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Due in October, I think. Around the time the first snow falls." Nathan pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. She felt wetness on her neck and realized he was crying too. "I thought I'd never have children," he said roughly. "After Emily died, I thought that chance was gone. And now you're giving me this. Giving us this. Margaret, I don't even have words. They sat together on their porch as the sun set, planning and dreaming. They talked about names, about whether it would be a boy or girl, about how they'd need to build a cradle and prepare the spare bedroom as a nursery. Nathan was already planning every detail, making sure Margaret would have everything she needed, already being protective of both her and their unborn child. You'll need to take it easier, he said seriously. No more heavy lifting. No more working yourself to exhaustion in the garden. Margaret laughed. Nathan, I'm pregnant, not invalid. Women have been having babies and working right up until delivery since the beginning of time. But she was touched by his concern, by the fierce protectiveness in his eyes. I just want you safe, he said. Both of you safe. You're my whole world, Margaret. You and this baby. I can't lose you. She understood his fear. He'd lost his first wife, had known that kind of devastating loss. Of course he'd be afraid. You won't lose me, she promised. I'm strong and healthy. Women in my family have babies easily. This baby and I are going to be just fine. And you're going to be an amazing father. The months of her pregnancy passed in peaceful contentment. Margaret's belly grew round, and Nathan couldn't stop touching it, marveling at the life growing inside. When the baby started moving, he'd place his hand on her stomach for hours, feeling every kick and roll, his face filled with wonder. The town embraced them fully now, the last whispers of scandal long forgotten. The church ladies organized a quilting bee to make baby blankets. Mrs. Patterson threw Margaret a birthing celebration, an old tradition where the women gathered to give gifts and advice. Even Mrs. Henderson contributed a beautiful hand-embroidered christening gown. Nathan's deputy, Tom, joked endlessly about Nathan becoming a father, teasing him about sleepless nights and dirty diapers. But Nathan took it all with good humor, too happy to be bothered by gentle ribbing. He was going to be a father. After 3 years of grief and loneliness, he'd found love again, built a family, created a future full of hope. As Margaret's due date approached, Nathan became increasingly anxious. He insisted on being nearby at all times, checking on her constantly, jumping at every small sound. Nathan, Margaret said patiently one afternoon in early October, you need to relax. The baby isn't coming today. But she was wrong. That night, Margaret woke to sharp pain in her belly. She gasped, and Nathan was instantly awake, lighting the lamp with shaking hands. It's time? He asked, his face pale. She nodded, breathing through another contraction. Get Mrs. Patterson. She knows midwifery. Nathan was dressed and out the door in seconds, riding hard through the darkness to fetch the older woman. By the time he returned with Mrs. Patterson and 2 other experienced women, Margaret's contractions were coming regular and strong. They shooed Nathan out of the bedroom, telling him this was women's work, and he paced the front room like a caged animal, flinching every time he heard Margaret cry out. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. It was hard and painful, but Margaret was strong, and Mrs. Patterson was experienced. When dawn broke golden through the bedroom window, Margaret gave one final push, and their baby entered the world with a lusty cry. It's a boy, Mrs. Patterson announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean blanket. A healthy, beautiful boy. She called Nathan in, and he entered the bedroom looking terrified. But when he saw Margaret, sweaty, and exhausted but smiling, holding their son in her arms. His face transformed. He knelt beside the bed and looked at his child with such awe it made Margaret's heart overflow. "He's perfect," Nathan whispered, reaching out with one finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. Their son immediately gripped his father's finger, holding tight, and Nathan made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He's so small, so perfect." Margaret watched her husband fall in love with their child, saw the fierce protectiveness and pure devotion that crossed his face. "What should we name him?" she asked. Nathan looked up at her, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "What about Samuel? After my father, Samuel Nathan Cordell." Margaret tested the name in her mind and smiled. "Samuel. I love it. Welcome to the world, Samuel Cordell. Your father and I have been waiting for you." The women left them alone after ensuring both mother and baby were healthy, and Nathan climbed carefully onto the bed beside Margaret, his arm around her shoulders, as they both stared at their son. Samuel had a shock of dark auburn hair like his father, and was already showing signs of having Margaret's eyes. He was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. "Thank you," Nathan said softly, kissing Margaret's temple. "Thank you for this. For him, for everything." She leaned into him, exhausted but happier than she'd ever been. "We made him together," she said. "Out of love, out of hope. He's ours, Nathan. Our future." The first months of Samuel's life were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. He was a healthy, hungry baby who demanded attention at all hours, and both Margaret and Nathan stumbled through those early weeks in a haze of sleepless nights and constant feedings. But neither of them complained. Every smile, every coo, every small milestone felt like a miracle. Nathan proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor at night when Samuel was fussy, singing to him in his deep voice. Margaret would wake sometimes to find Nathan in the rocking chair by the fire, holding their son against his chest, both of them asleep. And the sight made her fall in love with her husband all over again. As winter deepened and the first snow fell, their little family settled into routines. Nathan continued his work as sheriff, but he came home every day for lunch to see his wife and son. Margaret cared for Samuel in their home, finding joy in the simple domesticity of it all. This was everything she dreamed of and thought she'd lost when her first husband died. A home, a family, a man who loved her deeply, a child to raise and cherish. On a cold December evening, they sat together by the fire, Samuel sleeping in his cradle nearby. Margaret was mending one of Nathan's shirts while he read aloud from a book of poetry they'd received as a gift. Outside, snow fell softly, covering the world in peaceful white. "Are you happy?" Nathan asked suddenly, setting down the book. Margaret looked up at him, at his handsome face in the firelight, at the love shining in his blue eyes. "Deliriously happy," she said honestly. "More than I ever thought possible. Are you?" He reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I spent 3 years in darkness after Emily died," he said quietly. 3 years going through the motions but not really living. I thought that was all I had left. Duty and service, and eventually death. And then you came into my life. You brought light back, Margaret. Hope, purpose, love. You gave me a son. You gave me a reason to wake up excited for each day. So yes, I'm happy. More than happy. I'm alive again." She set aside her mending and moved to sit in his lap, her arms around his neck. "I love you, Nathan Cordell," she said. "I love our life together. I love our son. I love everything we've built." He kissed her deeply, thoroughly, the kind of kiss that promised all the nights ahead of them. When they pulled apart, both breathing harder, he smiled at her. "I love you too, Margaret, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a widowed sheriff who ripped his shirt open in a blizzard." She laughed, the sound bright and joyful. "That was the best moment of my life," she said. "Well, one of the best. There have been quite a few since then." They sat together as the fire burned low and the snow fell outside, and their son slept peacefully nearby, and Margaret thought about how far they'd both come. From loneliness and loss to love and family. From fear and threat to safety and peace. From barely surviving to truly thriving. This was home. This was happiness. This was everything. Spring came again, melting the snow and coaxing new life from the earth. Margaret's garden flourished, producing vegetables in abundance. Nathan built a proper fence around their expanded property and bought a few head of cattle, starting a small herd. Samuel grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, smiling baby who laughed at everything and adored his father. The town of Stone Valley continued to grow and prosper. New families moved in, businesses opened, and civilization slowly tamed the wild frontier. Nathan remained sheriff, respected and trusted by everyone. Margaret became known as one of the kindest women in town, always ready to help a neighbor, to bring food to a sick family, to offer comfort to those in need. The women who'd once gossiped about her now came to her for advice. The church made her a deacon's wife, a position of respect and honor. One afternoon in late spring, Margaret was in her garden with Samuel playing on a blanket nearby when a familiar figure rode up the path. Her heart jumped, then steadied when she recognized the rider. It was Jake Morrison, the man who'd cut her fence all those months ago. But he looked different now, cleaned up and sober, his face showing genuine remorse. "Mrs. Cordell," he said, dismounting and removing his hat. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to speak with you if you have a moment." Margaret stood slowly, wiping dirt from her hands. "Mr. Morrison, I'm surprised to see you. I thought you were serving your sentence." He nodded. "I was. I got released early for good behavior, and because I testified against Reeves. I'm trying to make a fresh start, ma'am. Find honest work, live a decent life. But before I do, I needed to come here and apologize to you properly. What I did, the fence cutting, the threats, helping burn your barn, it was wrong. Unforgivable. You could have died because of me, and I have to live with that. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. And if there's anything I can do to make amends, any way I can help, I'll do it." Margaret studied him, seeing the sincerity in his face. She thought about holding grudges, about how poison could fester if you let it. And then she thought about grace, about second chances, about how she and Nathan had both been given new beginnings. "Thank you for the apology, Mr. Morrison," she said. "I accept it, and I forgive you. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, ma'am. You don't know what that means." Nathan arrived home as Morrison was leaving, and Margaret watched the two men nod to each other with mutual respect. "You all right?" Nathan asked, his hand going to his gun instinctively. "I'm fine," Margaret assured him. "He came to apologize. It was the right thing to do." Nathan relaxed and smiled at her. "You're a better person than most. You know that?" She shrugged. "I've been forgiven for my mistakes. Seems only fair to extend the same grace to others." That evening, they received word that Jackson Reeves had died in prison. An illness had taken him quickly, and he'd been buried in the prison cemetery without ceremony. Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions at the news. She didn't mourn him, exactly, but she felt something like sadness that his life had come to such an end. "He could have been different," she said to Nathan. "He had wealth and influence. He could have used it for good. Could have helped people instead of hurting them. What a waste." Nathan pulled her close. "Some people choose darkness," he said. "It's not your job to save them all. You can just live your life with light and hope that it makes a difference." She nodded against his chest. "I suppose you're right." As summer arrived in full force, their property bloomed with life. Margaret's garden was the envy of every woman in Stone Valley, producing tomatoes and squash and beans in abundance. She canned and preserved, filling their shelves with enough food to last through the next winter. Nathan's small cattle herd grew, and he hired a young man to help with the ranch work so he could focus more on his sheriff duties and his family. Samuel grew into a toddler, walking early and getting into everything, his auburn curls and blue eyes making him the darling of the town. Every Sunday, the Cordell family attended church together, sitting in the third pew, and Margaret would catch Nathan looking at her and Samuel with such love it made her chest tight. This was their life now, simple and good, and full of small joys. One evening in late July, Nathan came home with news. "The territorial governor is coming through Stone Valley next month," he said. "There's talk of Oregon applying for statehood, and he's meeting with local leaders to discuss it. He wants to meet with me, talk about law enforcement structures in the new state." Margaret felt pride swell in her chest. "Nathan, that's wonderful. He must respect your work." Her husband shrugged, but she could see he was pleased. "I've done my job. Kept the peace, treated people fairly. Apparently that's enough to get noticed." The governor's visit was a grand affair. The whole town turned out to welcome him, and there was a formal dinner at the new hotel. Nathan, uncomfortable in his best suit, gave a speech about frontier justice and the importance of law in building civilization. Margaret sat in the audience, holding Samuel, and watched her husband command the room with his quiet authority and genuine integrity. After the dinner, the governor pulled Nathan aside for a private conversation. When Nathan returned to Margaret, he looked stunned. "What did he say?" she asked. Nathan shook his head slowly. "He offered me a position as territorial marshal. Said he needs men of character as Oregon moves toward statehood. It would mean more travel, more responsibility, but also more pay and influence. He wants an answer by the end of the month." Margaret's mind raced. Territorial marshal was a prestigious position, one that could open doors for their future. But it would also mean Nathan gone more often, facing more danger. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Nathan looked at her, at Samuel sleeping in her arms, at the life they'd built. "I want to talk to my wife," he said, "and decide together, because whatever I choose affects all of us." They spent the next week discussing it. weighing the pros and cons. The position would mean better financial security for their family, would give Nathan influence to shape law enforcement across the territory, but it would also mean him away from home for weeks at a time, would put him in more dangerous situations, would disrupt the peaceful life they'd found. Finally, Margaret made the decision for them. "Take it," she said firmly one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. Nathan looked at her in surprise. "Are you sure? I know it would be hard on you, me being gone so much." She took his hand. "Nathan, you're meant for more than just sheriffing a small town. You have integrity and courage and wisdom. Oregon needs men like you as it grows and changes. Yes, I'll miss you when you're gone. Yes, it will be hard. But I'm strong enough to handle it. We both know I can manage on my own when needed. And the work you'd be doing is important. You could make a real difference." He studied her face, seeing the certainty there. "What did I do to deserve you?" he asked softly. She smiled. "You ripped your shirt open in a blizzard," she said. Everything else followed from there. Nathan accepted the position of territorial marshal. The transition took several months, training a new sheriff for Stone Valley, learning his new responsibilities, traveling to meet with law enforcement officials across Oregon. Margaret managed their property with capable efficiency, hiring help when needed, caring for Samuel, maintaining their home. When Nathan was away, she missed him terribly, but she also found strength in her independence. She wasn't the desperate widow she'd been 2 years ago, helpless in the face of Jackson Reeves' threats. She was a marshal's wife, a mother, a woman who'd survived blizzards and barn burnings and come out stronger. When Nathan came home from his trips, their reunions were joyful. He'd sweep her into his arms, kiss her until they were both breathless, then scoop up Samuel and throw him in the air until the boy shrieked with laughter. They'd spend his days home reconnecting, making love like newlyweds, talking for hours about everything they'd experienced while apart. It wasn't an easy life, but it was a good one. By the time Samuel turned 2, Margaret was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. Nathan was home when their daughter was born in the spring of 1874. A beautiful girl with her mother's honey blonde hair and her father's blue eyes. They named her Emily Rose, honoring Nathan's first wife and giving their daughter a fresh start. Samuel adored his baby sister, constantly wanting to help care for her, bringing her toys, singing to her in his childish voice. Margaret watched her family grow and felt a contentment so deep it sometimes moved her to tears. She had everything she'd ever wanted, and so much more than she dared dream. By 1875, 3 years after that fateful blizzard, where everything had changed, the Cordell family was thoroughly established in Stone Valley. Nathan's work as territorial marshal had earned him respect across Oregon. Margaret's kindness and community involvement had made her beloved by everyone who knew her. Their children were healthy and happy. Their property was thriving. One evening in late autumn, Margaret stood in her garden harvesting the last of the season's vegetables while Samuel and Emily played nearby. She heard hoofbeats and looked up to see Nathan riding home early from a trip. Her heart lifted the way it always did when she saw him, even after 3 years of marriage. Some things never got old. Nathan dismounted and came straight to her, pulling her into his arms despite her dirty hands and work dress. "I have news," he said, grinning. "Oregon's been granted statehood. We're officially the 33rd state as of February, and the new governor wants me as the state's first marshal. It's a permanent position, Margaret. Stable. Based here in Stone Valley. No more long trips away. Margaret felt joy surge through her. Nathan, that's wonderful. She threw her arms around his neck. You'll be home every night? Really? He laughed and spun her around. Every night. I'll have deputies who do the traveling. I'll coordinate and oversee, but I'll be here. With you and our children, building our life together. That night, they celebrated with their children. And later, after the children were asleep, they celebrated privately in their bedroom. I love our life, Margaret whispered as they lay tangled together. I love you. I love our children. I love everything we've built from that moment in the snow when you saved me. Nathan traced his fingers along her face, his touch reverent. You saved me too, he said. I was dead inside before you came into my world. You brought me back to life, Margaret. Gave me a reason to hope, to dream, to love again. You gave me a family. You gave me everything. She kissed him softly. We gave each other everything, she corrected. We built this together. Through the hard times and the good, through fear and triumph, together. He pulled her closer. Together, he agreed. Always together. The years passed in peaceful contentment. Oregon grew and changed as statehood brought new settlers, new opportunities, new challenges. Nathan served with honor as state marshal, respected by everyone who worked with him. Margaret raised their children with love and wisdom, teaching them kindness and courage. Samuel grew tall and strong, showing signs of his father's integrity. Emily was gentle and bright, with her mother's warmth and her father's determination. They added a third child in 1877, a boy they named Thomas, and then a fourth in 1879, a girl named Catherine. Their house expanded to accommodate the growing family, and their property became known as one of the finest in the county. Margaret's gardens were legendary, and she taught other women her techniques. Nathan trained young lawmen, passing on his knowledge and principles. They became pillars of their community, the kind of couple people looked up to and aspired to emulate. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1882, Nathan took Margaret to Portland for a weekend, their first time away from the children. They stayed in a fancy hotel, ate in fine restaurants, and spent hours just talking and being together, without the constant demands of children and responsibilities. Do you ever regret it? Nathan asked one evening as they walked along the river. Marrying me? So quickly? Taking on all of this? Margaret stopped and looked at him in genuine surprise. Regret? Nathan, loving you and building this life with you has been the greatest joy of my existence. The only thing I regret is not meeting you sooner. He pulled her close, right there on the public street, and kissed her tenderly. I love you, Margaret Cordell. More today than the day I married you. More every year we're together. She smiled against his lips. I love you too, and I always will. When they returned home, their children rushed to greet them, full of stories about their time with their grandmother. Margaret scooped up Catherine, their youngest, while Nathan caught Thomas mid-leap. Samuel and Emily hung on their parents' arms, talking over each other. This was home, this chaos and love and family. This was everything they'd fought for, everything they'd built from ashes and snow and desperate hope. As winter approached again in late 1882, Margaret stood at her kitchen window watching snow begin to fall. 10 years since that blizzard that had changed everything. 10 years since Nathan had ripped his shirt open to warm her frozen hands. 10 years since she'd looked at him and felt her heart wake up after 2 years of grief and loneliness. Nathan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She leaned back against him, watching the snow fall. "I'm thinking about that day," she said. 10 years ago, when you found me in the blizzard, when you saved my life and changed my world." He tightened his arms around her. "Best day of my life," he said. "Well, one of the best. There have been quite a few since then." She laughed and turned in his arms to face him. His auburn hair had threads of silver now, and there were lines around his eyes from years of smiling. But he was still the same man who'd torn his shirt open without hesitation. Still the same man who'd stood beside her against impossible odds. Still the same man who made her heart race with just a look. "I would do it all again," she said seriously. "Every hardship, every fear, every struggle. If it led to this moment right here, I'd do it all again, in a heartbeat." Nathan cupped her face in his hands, his blue eyes intense. "So would I, 1,000 times over. You're my whole world, Margaret, you and our children. Everything good in my life came from that moment in the snow when I found you frozen and desperate and beautiful. I thank God every day that I went looking for you that day, that I found you in time." She rose on her toes and kissed him, deep and long, the kind of kiss that promised all the years ahead of them. Around them, their children played, and the fire crackled, and the snow fell gently outside. This was their life. This was their love story, from desperate widow and lonely widower to devoted husband and wife, from fear and threat to safety and peace, from barren loneliness to abundant family. They'd built it together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. And it was beautiful. The winter of 1882 passed peacefully. Their children grew another year older, another year wiser. Samuel, now 10, was already showing signs of wanting to follow in his father's footsteps, asking about law enforcement, practicing with a wooden gun Nathan had carved for him. Emily, at 8, was tender-hearted and nurturing, constantly caring for injured birds and stray cats she found. Thomas, at 5, was pure mischief, always into something, making them laugh with his antics. And Catherine, at 3, was their baby, though Margaret suspected not for long. She and Nathan had been blessed with easy fertility, and she had a feeling another child might be on the way. Spring of 1883 brought confirmation of her suspicion. She was pregnant again, their 5th child, due in late autumn. Nathan received the news with his usual joy, though he also fretted about her health. "You've had 4 babies already," he said, his hand on her stomach. "Is it safe? Are you sure you're all right?" She laughed and kissed his worry away. "I'm 39 years old and healthy as a horse. This baby will be fine. We'll be fine." And they were. Their 5th child, a boy they named William, arrived in November without complications. Their house, now quite large with all the additions they'd built over the years, rang with the sounds of children and laughter and life. Margaret sometimes looked around at her abundant family and marveled at how far she'd come. From that desperate widow trying to hold on to a failing ranch, terrorized by a powerful man, to this, a respected marshal's wife with 5 healthy children, a thriving property, a loving husband, and a place of honor in their community. It felt like a fairy tale, except it was real. It was her life. Nathan's career continued to flourish. By 1885, he was training the next generation of lawmen across Oregon, teaching them the principles he lived by: integrity, fairness, courage, and compassion. Young men came from across the state to learn from Marshal Nathan Cordell, and he took his responsibility seriously. He wanted to leave Oregon better than he'd found it, wanted to create a legacy of justice and honor. At home, he was a devoted father, patient and loving with all 5 of their children. He taught Samuel and Thomas to ride and shoot, played tea party with Emily and Catherine, and walked the floor at night with baby William when he was fussy. Margaret would watch him with their children and fall in love with him all over again. This was the man who'd ripped his shirt open in a blizzard, yes, but he was so much more. He was the man who braided their daughter's hair when Margaret was tired, who read bedtime stories in different voices to make the children laugh, who never missed a school recital or church program. He was the man who still kissed her goodbye every morning like he might not see her again, who still held her hand when they walked through town, who still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world, even after 13 years of marriage and 5 babies. One evening, in the summer of 1885, their whole family gathered on the expanded porch they'd built. Samuel was reading aloud from an adventure novel, his young voice confident and clear. Emily was embroidering a handkerchief, her stitches neat and careful. Thomas and Catherine were playing with wooden blocks Nathan had made, building elaborate structures. Baby William dozed in Margaret's arms, his tiny hand curled around her finger. Nathan sat beside her in his rocking chair, his hand resting on her knee, and Margaret felt such overwhelming contentment it brought tears to her eyes. "What's wrong, Mama?" Emily asked, noticing. Margaret smiled and wiped her eyes. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. I'm just happy. So very, very happy." Nathan squeezed her knee gently. "Tears of joy?" he asked softly. She nodded. "I was just thinking about how blessed we are, about how good God has been to us, about how much I love all of you." Their children came to cluster around her, hugging her carefully so as not to disturb sleeping William, and Nathan's arm came around her shoulders, holding them all together. This was everything. This moment right here. This was what they'd fought for through blizzards and barn fires and powerful enemies. This was what love had built. As the years continued to pass, their children grew into remarkable young people. Samuel, serious and thoughtful, decided he wanted to be a lawyer rather than a lawman, wanting to serve justice through the courts as his father served it through enforcement. Nathan was immensely proud. Emily showed artistic talent, her drawings and paintings capturing the beauty of Oregon in ways that made people stop and stare. Thomas proved to be a natural horseman, working with their ranch animals with an intuitive understanding. Catherine was brilliant with numbers, helping Margaret keep their household accounts and already talking about becoming a school teacher. And William, their youngest, was growing into a gentle, curious child who loved books and nature in equal measure. By 1888, 16 years after that fateful blizzard, the Cordell family was one of the most respected in Oregon. Nathan had been honored by the state legislature for his years of service. Margaret had been recognized by the Women's Auxiliary for her charitable work and community leadership. Their children were thriving. Their property was prosperous. Their love was as strong as ever. One autumn afternoon, Margaret was working in her garden, now famous throughout the county, when she heard familiar hoofbeats. She looked up to see Nathan riding home early, just as he had so many years ago with news of his promotion. But they were older now, their bodies marked by time and work, and the bearing of children. Nathan's auburn hair was more silver than brown, his face weathered by years in the sun. Margaret's honey blonde hair had threads of white, her figure softer after bearing 5 children. But when their eyes met, the spark was still there. The electricity, the deep, abiding love that had carried them through everything. Nathan dismounted and came to her, pulling her into his arms right there in the garden. "I have news," he said, smiling. "The governor has asked me to retire with full honors. Says I've served long enough, earned the right to spend my remaining years with my family. There's a generous pension, Margaret. We'll be comfortable. We can travel if we want, or stay right here and watch our grandchildren grow up, whatever we choose." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "You're really ready to retire? To step back from the work?" He cupped her face gently. "I'm 60 years old, love. I've served Oregon for 16 years as marshal, and before that as sheriff. I've trained good men to take over. It's time to let the younger generation lead, while I enjoy what I've built with you." That evening, they gathered their children to share the news. Samuel, now 26 and recently married himself, grinned. "Does this mean you'll have time to help me build that addition on my house, Pa? My wife is expecting our first child, and we need the space." Nathan's face lit up at the mention of becoming a grandfather. "Of course I'll help. I'd be honored." Emily, now 24 and engaged to a young artist from Portland, hugged her father. "Maybe you and Mama could visit us after I'm married? See the city?" Thomas, 21 and working their ranch full-time, clapped his father on the shoulder. "I could use an extra set of hands around here, if you're interested in actual ranching instead of just chasing outlaws." Catherine, 19 and teaching at the local school, smiled. "We're so proud of you, Papa. Everything you've accomplished." And William, still just 14, but wise beyond his years, simply hugged his father tight. "I'm glad you'll be home more," he said. Nathan held his youngest son close, emotion thick in his voice. "So am I, son. So am I." After the children dispersed to their various evening activities, Nathan and Margaret walked out to the edge of their property, to the fence line that overlooked the valley below. The autumn sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the first cold bite of approaching winter was in the air. 16 years, Margaret said softly, leaning against Nathan's side. 16 years since you found me in that blizzard. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago, all at once. Nathan's arm came around her waist. "Best decision I ever made, riding out to look for you that day. Changed my whole life. Gave me everything I never thought I'd have again." She turned in his arms to face him. "We've built something beautiful, haven't we? Despite everything that tried to stop us. Despite Jackson Reeves and the gossip and all the challenges. We built this life together, and it's been so good, Nathan. So much better than I ever dreamed." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, gentle kisses that spoke of years of tenderness and devotion. "It's not over yet. he said with a smile. We've got years ahead of us still. Grandchildren to spoil, gardens to tend, rocking chairs to sit in while we watch the sunset. I plan to love you until my last breath, Margaret Cordell. And if I'm very lucky, that won't be for a long, long time. She laughed, the sound carrying across their property. You're stuck with me, Marshall Cordell. For better or worse, remember? Though it's been mostly better. All better, he corrected. Even the hard parts were worth it, because we faced them together. They stood watching the sun sink below the horizon, the sky deepening to purple, and then indigo. Stars began to appear, scattered across the darkening sky like diamonds. Margaret thought about that young widow she'd been, desperate and alone, trying to defend her property against an enemy she couldn't defeat by herself. She thought about the lonely sheriff who'd been going through the motions, his heart locked away behind walls of grief. And she thought about how one blizzard, one moment of crisis, one act of desperate heroism had brought them together and changed everything. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day? She asked. If I'd frozen out there in the snow, or if you'd decided it was too dangerous to search? Nathan was quiet for a moment. I try not to think about it, he said finally, because the idea of a world where I lost you before I ever really found you, that's too terrible to contemplate. But I will say this. I believe God put us in each other's paths for a reason. I think we were meant to find each other, meant to love each other, meant to build this life together. Call it fate or providence or just dumb luck. But I don't think anything could have kept us apart. Margaret smiled and snuggled closer to him. I like to think you're right, that we were meant for each other from the beginning, that all the pain and loss we both experienced was leading us to that moment in the snow when everything changed. They walked back to their house, hand in hand, the lights glowing warmly in the windows, the sounds of their children's voices drifting out into the evening. This was home. This was family. This was love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. Over the next months, as winter settled in again, and Nathan officially retired from his position, they fell into new rhythms. Nathan spent his days working on the ranch with Thomas, building the addition for Samuel's house, and finally tackling all the projects around their own home that he'd never had time for. Margaret continued her garden planning, her community work, and her role as matriarch of their growing family. When Samuel and his wife had their baby in January of 1889, Margaret and Nathan became grandparents for the first time. The baby girl, named Margaret Rose, after both her grandmothers, brought joy that reminded them both of when their own children were small. We're old now, Margaret said one evening as they rocked their granddaughter together. Officially old. Grandparents. Nathan laughed. Speak for yourself. I feel young as ever. But his silver hair and the lines around his eyes told a different story. They were aging, both of them, their bodies showing the wear of over 60 years of life. But their love hadn't aged. If anything, it had deepened, matured like fine wine, becoming richer and more precious with every passing year. On a cold February evening in 1890, 18 years after that life-changing blizzard, Margaret and Nathan sat together by their fire, after all the children and grandchildren had gone to their own homes. Samuel now had 2 children. Emily had married and was expecting her first. Thomas was courting a sweet girl from town. Catherine was engaged to a fellow teacher. Even William, now 19, was showing interest in the minister's daughter. Their family was expanding, growing, thriving. "We did good," Nathan said softly, his hand finding Margaret's as they sat side by side. "Raised good children, built a good life, made a real difference in this world." Margaret squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar strength there despite his age. "We did it together," she said. "Every step of the way. Through the fear and the joy, the hardships and the triumphs, together." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes still as sharp and clear as they'd been that day in the blizzard. "I love you, Margaret. I've loved you from the moment you looked at me with those warm brown eyes and smiled at me after church all those years ago. I'll love you until I take my last breath and beyond." She felt tears slip down her cheeks, happy tears. "I love you too, Nathan. You gave me everything. A home, a family, a purpose. You made me feel alive again when I thought I'd be numb forever. You showed me that love could happen twice, that hearts could heal, that second chances were real." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling, the winter wind singing outside their walls. This house had seen so much life. 5 children born within these walls, countless meals shared around their table, arguments and reconciliations, laughter and tears, all the messy, beautiful reality of a life well lived. "Do you have any regrets?" Margaret asked suddenly. Nathan thought about it, really thought. "Not a single one," he said finally. "Not one moment I'd change. Because every moment, good and bad, led me to right here, right now. Led me to you and our family and this life we've built. How could I regret any of that?" Margaret nodded, feeling the same. If she could go back and tell that desperate widow in 1872 that everything would be all right, that love was waiting just around the corner in the form of a widowed sheriff who would tear his shirt open to save her, that woman would never have believed it. But it had all been true, every impossible, beautiful bit of it. They went to bed that night wrapped in each other's arms, the way they had for 18 years. Nathan's body was familiar to her now, every scar and muscle memorized by her hands. Her body had changed too, marked by time and childbearing, softer and rounder than the young widow she'd been. But Nathan still held her like she was precious, still touched her with reverence, still made her feel beautiful and desired. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair in the darkness, "for taking a chance on me, for marrying me so quickly, for building this life with me, for giving me children, for standing beside me through everything. Thank you, Margaret." She turned in his arms and kissed him, deep and sweet. "Thank you for finding me in that blizzard," she whispered back. "Thank you for ripping your shirt open and warming my hands. Thank you for making me feel safe, for loving me, for giving me a reason to hope again. Thank you for everything, Nathan." They held each other as sleep claimed them, their breathing synchronizing the way it had after so many years of sharing a bed. Outside, snow began to fall softly, covering their property in white. Inside, the fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls of their bedroom. And 2 hearts that had been broken and lonely beat as one, steady and strong, sustained by a love that had conquered fear and built something lasting and true. This was their story. This was their love, born in a blizzard, forged in fire, tempered by time, and made stronger with every passing year. From frozen desperation to abundant joy. From loneliness to belonging. From barely surviving to truly thriving. They had built it together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time, and it was beautiful. Years continued to pass in peaceful succession. Nathan and Margaret grew older gracefully, their silver hair and weathered faces badges of a life well lived. They became the wise elders of Stone Valley, the couple everyone looked up to, the ones young people asked for advice. They had more grandchildren, eventually too many to count easily, and each one was a blessing that made their hearts overflow. They celebrated their 20th anniversary in 1892, then their 25th in 1897. By the turn of the century, they were in their 70s, slowing down but still together, still in love, still grateful for every day they had. On their 30th anniversary in 1902, their entire family gathered for a celebration. All 5 of their children, now fully grown with families of their own, dozens of grandchildren running around their property, a few great-grandchildren already making appearances. The house was full of noise and laughter and love, and Margaret stood in the center of it all, watching her family with wonder. This had all started with a blizzard, with a desperate ride through snow, with a sheriff who'd torn his shirt open to warm frozen hands. Everything else had grown from that single moment of connection. Nathan found her standing by the window, watching the celebration, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, just as he had so many times over the decades. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he asked, his voice raspier now with age, but still the voice she loved. "I'm thinking about us," she said, leaning back against him. "About how far we've come. About how much we've built. About how lucky I am that you found me in that blizzard 30 years ago." He rested his chin on her shoulder. "I'm the lucky one. You gave me a reason to live again, Margaret. You gave me everything." They stood together watching their family, the legacy they'd created, the love they'd shared and multiplied. "I'd do it all over again," Margaret said. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it, if it led me to you." Nathan turned her in his arms and kissed her, gentle and sweet. The kiss of a man who'd been kissing the same woman for 30 years and still found wonder in it. "So would I," he said, 1,000 times over. "You're my whole heart, Margaret Cordell. My whole life, my everything." She smiled up at him, her brown eyes still warm despite the years. "And you're mine, from that moment in the snow until forever. You're mine, and I'm yours, and that's all that matters." Their family surrounded them then, calling them over to cut the anniversary cake, to hear stories of the old days, to celebrate the love that had built this entire dynasty. And as Nathan took Margaret's hand and led her to the center of the celebration, both of them smiling, both of them grateful, both of them still so deeply in love, she thought about that frozen, desperate widow she'd been, that woman who'd thought her life was over, that happiness was impossible, that love was a thing of the past. She'd been so wrong. Love had been waiting for her in the form of a widowed sheriff with auburn hair and blue eyes. Love had been waiting to transform her life in ways she'd never imagined. And that love, born in a blizzard and nurtured through decades, had created all of this. This family, this joy, this beautiful, abundant life. As the sun set on their 30th anniversary celebration, and the last of their family finally headed home, Nathan and Margaret sat together on their porch one more time. The same porch where they'd sat so many evenings over the years, watching their children grow, planning their future, simply being together. "Tired?" Nathan asked, taking her hand. Margaret shook her head. "Content, so perfectly content I could burst." He smiled and brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "Me too, love. Me too." They sat in the gathering darkness, two old people who'd loved each other through everything life could throw at them, who'd built a legacy that would last for generations, who'd proven that second chances were real, that love could bloom even in the depths of winter, that hope and courage and commitment could create miracles. "I love you, Nathan Cordell," Margaret said into the quiet evening. "I've loved you for 30 years, and I'll love you for 30 more, if God grants us the time." Nathan squeezed her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm, the way he'd done since that first day. "I love you too, Margaret. More than words can say. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, the absolute best." As full darkness fell and the stars came out above them, they rose together and walked hand in hand into their house, into the warmth and light, into the home they'd built together. The door closed behind them, shutting out the cold, holding in the love. And somewhere in the heavens, if such things could be seen, the stars shone a little brighter over the Cordell homestead, over a love that had started with a torn shirt and frozen hands, over a love that had weathered every storm and emerged victorious, over a love that would endure until the very end and beyond, eternal and true and absolutely worth every moment it took to find.